The flight that would change everything. The airport was alive with movement, the sound of rolling luggage, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional announcement over the loudspeaker. James Carter stood out among the chaos. A man in his late 40s, sharply dressed in a tailored business suit. His briefcase was in hand, his tie perfectly straight, and his shoes polished to a mirror shine. James looked like a man with purpose, and he was. James worked for a well-known tech company. His life was one meeting after another, one business trip after another. His days were filled with calls, deadlines, and presentations, and he thrived on the feeling of being successful. His job had given him a lifestyle most people envied: nice cars, a comfortable home, and the constant satisfaction of achieving goals. But despite his success, there was always a nagging fear in the back of his mind, the fear that one mistake could erase everything he had worked for. Today's flight to New York was supposed to solidify everything. He had a big business deal to close, and this trip felt crucial. First class was always a treat, and James knew it. The big, cushy seats, the space, the personal service, it made him feel important, and he liked that feeling. He imagined himself stepping off the plane in New York, deal in hand, and feeling unstoppable. As he walked toward the gate for his flight, he couldn't shake the excitement in his chest. He was ready to take his seat, relax, and enjoy the journey. His mind was focused, his confidence high. But then, as he boarded the plane and made his way to his seat, James came to an abrupt stop. His eyes fell on the person sitting next to him, a young black woman in a simple hoodie and jeans. She looked casual, unassuming, and friendly enough, but James didn't feel at ease. She looked up at him and smiled warmly. "Hi," she said. James hesitated, unsure of how to respond. His instinct was to look away. There was something about sitting next to her, something about her simple outfit and her unbothered smile, that made him uncomfortable. Why is she sitting here? James wondered to himself. Why did I have to sit next to her? James tried to shake the feeling. He'd always been proud of his ability to stay composed, of his ability to project confidence and success. But now a little voice in his head was pulling him back. This wasn't the kind of first-class flight he had envisioned. And just like that, the trip that was supposed to build his confidence and lead him to victory was already starting to make him question himself. He didn't know it yet, but this flight would be far more than just another business trip. It would push him to confront his assumptions, his fears, and his pride, and ultimately change how he saw himself and the people around him. James sat down in his seat, gripping his briefcase tighter. His journey to New York would soon turn into a journey of self-discovery, one that would catch him by surprise. A surprise encounter in the sky. James leaned back in his seat, staring at the young woman next to him. She looked calm, relaxed, and completely unbothered by the fact that they were sitting side by side on a first-class flight. She pulled out a book, completely focused on her reading, while James couldn't shake his discomfort. His mood had soured, and no amount of adjusting his seat would make it better. The plane had taken off smoothly, and James tried to focus on his work. He flipped open his laptop, ready to finish sending emails and preparing for his big meeting in New York. His success depended on this deal, and his mind was supposed to be sharp. But his attention kept drifting. His eyes kept returning to the woman beside him. Why is she even sitting here? James thought, shaking his head. She doesn't seem like the kind of person who belongs in first class. He couldn't explain why the thought annoyed him so much. He had always been proud of his achievements, of the life he worked so hard to build. First class wasn't just about luxury to him. It was a status symbol, and sitting next to someone who didn't seem like they belonged felt like a challenge to his perception. The flight attendants came by with drink options. They greeted her warmly, their smiles wide and genuine. She smiled back, chatting with them effortlessly, even sharing a laugh with one of them. James found himself staring. His frustration grew. Why are they being so friendly to her, like she's royalty or something? James whispered to himself, barely able to contain his irritation. And then, as though from nowhere, a man from a few rows back approached the woman. He had a bright smile, and his voice carried excitement as he spoke. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm a big fan of your work. It's so great to meet you." James froze. His eyes darted between them as the woman smiled warmly, accepting the compliment with genuine kindness. She even agreed to take a photo with him before he returned to the seat. James was baffled. Who is she? James thought, his curiosity turning to frustration. What does she do that has people like this coming up to her mid-flight? Unable to resist his curiosity, James turned toward her. His voice was sharper than he intended as he asked, "What do you do?" She looked up from her book and smiled again, calm and confident. "I run my own business," she said simply. James frowned, trying to process her words. "What kind of business?" he pressed. "Real estate," she said. "I've been buying properties for years. Now I manage a lot of them across the country." James blinked. He leaned back in his seat and stared out the window, his mind spinning. Real estate, he thought. He'd pictured someone successful, sure. But this, she didn't look like someone managing a massive business empire. The thoughts swirled in his mind. He didn't say anything more. His hands gripped the edge of his laptop as he struggled to sort through his emotions. Part of him couldn't shake the disbelief. He'd spent his entire life building his own success. And now here she was, unassuming, casual, and seemingly so successful. Embarrassed by his assumptions and his judgment, James looked away. His pride felt bruised. This brief conversation, small as it might seem, was the spark that would soon set everything in motion. James didn't know it yet, but this encounter was about to test the very way he saw himself, his beliefs, and the way he approached success and assumptions. For James, the journey was just beginning, and the first challenge had appeared, uninvited, in the seat next to him. Doubts and discoveries mid-flight. James sat stiffly in his seat, the uneasy feeling in his chest refusing to go away. He kept glancing at the woman next to him, who was calmly writing in her notebook. There was nothing extraordinary about her. Normal clothes, normal posture, normal smile. But the mention of her managing properties across the country lingered in his mind. How could someone like her have such an important role? James wondered, his brow furrowing. Her calm confidence only made it worse. She looked so unbothered, so sure of herself, while James was busy feeling judgmental and insecure. The flight attendant brought their meals and set a tray in front of the woman. With a cheerful smile, she said, "Is there anything else you need, Ms. Brooks?" James froze. That name, Brooks. His mind clicked. He remembered a real estate company called Brooks Enterprises. Could it be that she was connected to it? If so, she wasn't just a manager. She must be very successful. His curiosity pushed harder against his discomfort. Before James could let his thoughts spiral further, another passenger came nervously up from the back of the plane. She held a small book in her hand, and her voice was soft as she spoke. "Hi, I just wanted to say thank you. Your advice and videos helped me start my business. I couldn't have done it without you." James couldn't believe his ears. Videos? Advice? His eyes darted back to the woman, who now looked at the passenger with kindness and warmth. "That's wonderful to hear," she said in an encouraging voice. "Keep working hard. Success takes time." Her words were simple but genuine, and James was stunned. People admired her. She wasn't just successful. She was admired by others, people who looked up to her. His discomfort grew. "Wow," James managed to say, trying to push down his own feelings. "You seem to know a lot of people." She turned to him with a small smile and a calm tone. "I guess I've been lucky to meet many amazing people," she said simply. Before he could respond, the plane suddenly shook, jolting the cabin. Gasps came from all over as the turbulence intensified. James gripped the armrest, his heart pounding. The plane rattled, and murmurs of worry swept through the cabin. But Miss Brooks didn't flinch. She looked across the aisle at an elderly man who appeared pale and anxious. Without hesitation, she leaned over and said in a gentle, reassuring voice, "Don't worry, this will pass. Just take a deep breath." The man nodded, and James watched as his expression shifted from panic to calm. James was amazed. How could she remain so composed during something like this? Finally, he couldn't resist any longer. His voice came out before he could stop it. "Are you always this calm?" She looked at him with a kind smile and said, "I've been through tougher things than this," her voice laced with confidence and just a hint of humor. The plane stopped shaking, and the cabin settled back into a quieter rhythm. But James couldn't stop his thoughts. He kept staring at her, wondering about her life. What kind of experiences must she have had to be this steady, this sure? A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned with a glass of wine and handed it to Miss Brooks with another bright smile. "Compliments from the captain," she said cheerfully. "He's a big fan of yours." James looked down at his laptop, but his hands no longer felt focused. A big fan of hers. That's when it hit him. Everyone on this plane seemed to know her. The flight attendants, other passengers, even the captain. She wasn't just a random passenger. She was important. James couldn't shake the feeling. His assumptions were crashing down around him. Here was this woman, normal in every visible way, calm, quiet, and yet seemingly so powerful, respected, and admired by so many. His thoughts grew louder. Why is this bothering me so much? James tried to return to his work. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, but his thoughts kept pulling him back to Miss Brooks. How had he judged her so quickly? How had he gotten her completely wrong? And that was the thing. This flight, this small encounter, had begun to shake everything James thought he knew about success, ambition, and judgment. He had assumed she wasn't supposed to belong in first class. Now he was starting to question his assumptions and himself. For James, this was only the beginning, the turning point in the sky. The plane had been flying steadily for a while, the gentle hum of the engines and the soft rhythm of conversation in the cabin creating a calm environment. But James couldn't stop thinking about Miss Brooks. Her quiet confidence lingered in his mind. There was something about her, something he couldn't put his finger on, that felt out of place or maybe just too certain. He wasn't someone who overthought things, but this wasn't just idle curiosity. His chest felt tight, his thoughts tangled. Why is she so at ease? Why does it feel like she has everything figured out? Finally, the tension became too much. James turned toward her, his voice shaky as he tried to make sense of his thoughts. "Miss Brooks, I have to ask you something." She looked at him, her expression as calm and composed as ever. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "Are you connected to Brooks Enterprises?" James blurted out before he could second-guess himself. His words came out faster than intended, and now that they were spoken, he could feel his heart pounding. Miss Brooks' face didn't change much at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on her notebook for a moment, and then she looked at him. She paused, as if weighing the question, before giving a small, deliberate nod. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm the CEO." James froze. His mind felt like it had just come to a screeching halt. His eyes widened and his mouth opened, but no words came. The woman sitting beside him wasn't just a passenger. She was the head of one of the biggest companies in the country, a name he had read about countless times in the business news and admired from a distance. His voice came out in a hushed whisper. "Why didn't you say anything?" She leaned back in her seat, the corners of her lips lifting into a small, calm smile. "Because not everything has to be about business," she said, her tone so soft it almost felt like an invitation rather than an answer. "Sometimes it's good to just connect with someone without expectations." James didn't know what to say. His confidence was gone, replaced by a swirling mix of embarrassment, awe, and uncertainty. His hands nervously tapped the edge of his laptop. Before he could respond, she spoke again. "You're struggling with something, aren't you?" James hesitated, caught off guard by her insight. Her words felt as if they had cut straight to the heart of his own fears. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself, but I feel stuck. I don't know how to make the right choices anymore." Her gaze was steady on him. It felt like she could see through all of his doubts and insecurities. She took a deep breath and said, "Sometimes you just have to trust your journey. The right choices won't always be clear, but you'll find the way if you listen to yourself." Her words hit James like a wave. They weren't just polite advice or motivational words. They felt personal, wise, and painfully real. As she spoke, he knew that she wasn't just speaking about success, business, or ambition. This was a lesson about life, about choices, fear, and trust. Was he ready to listen to himself? Could he let go of his fear and really trust his own path? The question lingered as the plane climbed higher into the sky. James felt like the answer to that question would determine more than just his career or his next decision. For a moment, it felt like his entire life was hanging in the balance, and the weight of it all rested on his next choice. The engines roared as the plane soared into a higher altitude, but James barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by one thing. Was he brave enough to trust himself, finding clarity in the clouds? The plane was still flying smoothly, the hum of the engines and the gentle sounds of the cabin creating an almost meditative atmosphere. But James couldn't shake the conversation with Ms. Brooks from his mind. Her words replayed over and over. Trust your journey. He looked down at his hands, nervously fiddling with his laptop. His thoughts felt jumbled, a swirl of fear, ambition, and self-doubt. He had come on this trip with his own goals, his own expectations, but now everything felt uncertain. Sitting next to a woman like Ms. Brooks, so composed, so sure of herself, made James feel smaller than he cared to admit. But instead of anger or jealousy, he felt an unexpected calm. Her words had shifted something inside him. What if I don't always have to prove myself? The thought lingered. What if I could just trust my instincts and let go of fear? Ms. Brooks sat beside him, looking out the window at the clouds as they drifted by. She wasn't pushing him to talk more or filling the space with unnecessary conversation. Her quiet gave James the space to sort through his thoughts. He wasn't sure of all the answers yet, but things felt different now. There was a spark of hope. After a few moments of silence, James took a deep breath, unsure of how to even start the conversation again. He turned toward her, his voice soft. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've made me think about a lot of things." She turned to look at him with a small, understanding smile. "You're welcome," she replied simply. Her voice was calm, her tone kind, and it made him feel less burdened. James could feel the weight in his chest lifting slightly. He still didn't know how he would find his way, but now he felt more hopeful. That small moment of honesty with her had given him clarity. Success, he realized, wasn't about being perfect or having every step planned. It wasn't about making every choice right on the first try. Success was about learning, evolving, and trusting himself through it all. He let his thoughts drift as the plane continued its steady flight. The fears that had felt suffocating moments ago didn't seem so big anymore. His path felt a little clearer, even if he didn't have all the answers yet. Looking out the window, James watched the clouds below. They looked soft and peaceful, like waves dancing over the earth. Ms. Brooks didn't speak much, but James could feel that she understood him in ways that words couldn't capture. Her calm presence and steady confidence made her advice stick with him. It wasn't just about ambition or goals. It was about learning to shift perspective and trusting himself. The journey wasn't over yet, but as James sat there beside her, he felt like he'd taken the first step toward discovering himself. And for now, that was enough. A new perspective at the journey's end. The plane began its descent, the sound of the engines humming steadily as James looked out the window at the view below. The city was coming into focus, and so was his mind. He felt much calmer now, lighter. His conversation with Ms. Brooks had given him clarity. Her words kept replaying in his head. Trust your journey. They had stuck with him, and as much as he didn't want to admit it, they had given him a new kind of strength. His fears, which had felt enormous before, didn't seem so overwhelming anymore. When the plane came to a smooth stop on the tarmac, James felt a wave of peace to settle over him. His fears didn't feel so large or controlling anymore. He turned his gaze to Ms. Brooks, sitting beside him. She wasn't intimidating or unapproachable. She was simply a strong, kind person who had shared honest, thoughtful advice at just the right moment. As they disembarked from the plane, they exchanged a quick, friendly goodbye. There was no need for long goodbyes. Their brief interaction had already made its mark. James felt grateful for her presence and for the reminder that sometimes the right people come into your life just when you need them most. Walking through the busy airport toward his next gate, James reflected on their conversation. He thought about what she had said, about trusting your path and learning to let go of fear. It wasn't about having everything figured out or being perfect. It was about listening to his heart, embracing change, and taking things step by step. Her words lingered. Trust your journey. Success wasn't about reaching some far-off destination or having all the answers. It was about growth, It was about learning, adapting, and being brave enough to face challenges, even when the path wasn't clear. James could feel hope blossoming in his chest. His fears no longer controlled him. His journey wasn't over, but now he felt equipped to keep moving forward, step by step, trusting himself along the way. He didn't have to know everything. He didn't have to force his way through every obstacle. He just needed to trust. And that was enough.